Of all the things Aristotle tried to prove, the thing he proved most successfully was how cruel history can be. Because here was one of the most magnificent thinkers of all time, and for most of us, if we know anything about him, it's a line from a Monty Python song.
I'm a granny whiskey every day, Aristotle was a bagger for the bottle.
It's like if in 2,000 years' time you asked people if they'd heard of Stephen Hawking, and everyone went, oh yeah, he's the bloke who got pissed in Dorking. Although Aristotle was a philosopher, he was extremely connected to the real world, to the point that he was the first person in history to compile a comprehensive list of all the winners of the Olympic Games. I love the idea of Aristotle in a bar with Plato going, God, give me any year you like, I'll show you who won the pole vault. All the ancient Greeks did was to ask the questions we all ask, except most of us stop when we're about 5. Because up until that age, you're full of enthusiasm and question everything. Mummy, daddy, why can't cats talk? How much does the moon weigh? Who invented cheese? Except the modern response is to go, bloody kids always asking questions. I know, we'll send them to school, that'll put a stop to that. Except the Greeks were more inquisitive.
In this programme, I'm going to suggest that the philosophy of Aristotle not only helped to shape his own age, which was one of the most exciting times in human history, but every other age up to our own.
The first thing to ask is why it was at that time, at that place, that there were so many philosophers. Usually it's assumed there were just loads of clever blokes at the time, figuring things out, like it was a craze.
And then for some reason, at some point between then and now, Greeks went off philosophy and took up being barbers instead.
And maybe at some point there was a crossover period where you went to have your hair cut and the barber said, is you on a day off today, sir? And you's lucky for it. If you is a soul, you'd never have a day off for it. It's immortal, isn't it? In fact, around 700 BC, a new layer of small farmers were able to make the land much more productive and began to challenge the big landowners for power. So a tension grew between the two groups, in which the aristocracy tended to see the small farmers as new money.
These smaller farmers became increasingly militant about demanding a say in the running of the towns and land, and conflicts continued, and the history of how they were resolved was written by Aristotle.
In his book Politics, he described how one Athenian, Solon, drew up what was probably the world's first political constitution, which was historic enough, but Solon did it as a poem. One part that explained his thinking went,
Now you, whose coffers are full, pressed down and overflowing, put a curb on your greedy soul.
Could you imagine any modern politician having enough passion to put forward a policy as a poem? The nearest to Solon that anyone from New Labour has got has been,
Now you, whose coffers are full, pressed down and overflowing, would you like to buy a hospital?
Solon's system was almost certainly the world's first democracy. 30,000 people were entitled not only to vote, but to attend the assembly and speak.
Now I should say at this point that however marvellous the civilisation was, it was based on the brutality of slavery, but we'll come on to that later. The first act of the democracy was to wipe out the debts owed by the small farmers to the aristocracy. Then a pool of 6,000 jurors was chosen by lot. Jurors and assembly members were paid, so that even the poorest citizens could stand for election.
So this was the Athens which gave birth to the new age of philosophy at the dawn of a new age of human history.
So throughout the rise of the city-states, there were people who asked questions about how the planets moved, how the body works, and what is the ideal life. But not only did they ask these questions, the wealth produced by the slave system meant that there were a layer of thinkers who had the leisure to pursue the answers. Pythagoras from the island of Samos attracted a group of followers who had strict demands.
Do not let swallows share one's roof. Do not pick up what is fallen. Do not eat from a whole loaf. Never eat beans.
Mathematicians like Pythagoras thought that maths was the highest thing you could aspire to because numbers were perfection. A bit like that old joke where the teacher says, what's 2 and 2? And the kid says, 4. So the teacher says, that's very good. And the kid says, what do you mean good? It's perfect. The first serious studies of anatomy were carried out by a doctor called Hippocrates, who gave his name to the Hippocratic Oath. And this is typical. Our words we use today come from philosophers of the time, such as Platonic from Plato.
You can hardly imagine that happening with today's politicians, so that in 2,000 years' time, if you keep stumbling over words and making no sense, people will say, "You're being very Prescottic today."
Around 470 BC, 90 years before Aristotle was born, Athens controlled an empire that stretched right across Greece and part of what is now Italy and Turkey. The confidence of the Athenians must have been similar to that of the Victorians at the height of the British Empire.
One of the consequences was that philosophers felt they could conquer the secrets of the universe, and by the time of Socrates they were the celebrities of society. From the Academy, Plato wrote that one day,
Socrates was thinking about something that he could not resolve, and stopped to stand fixed in thought from early dawn until noon, and a rumour spread that Socrates had been standing and thinking all day. By the evening, people had brought out their mats to sleep in the open air that they might watch him. There he stood until the following morning, when he offered a prayer to the sun and went on his way.
but the confidence of Athens was shattered when it was invaded by the Spartans. The democracy was maintained, but the notion of invincibility had collapsed. This was the world Aristotle was born into in the town of Stagira in Macedonia in 384 BC.
It was a world that contained all the exhilaration of the democracy, but was questioning some of the certainties of a few years before.
What we don't know much about is Aristotle's personal life, what with all this happening 2,400 years ago. We know he was probably married, but what were his sexual preferences? Did he have any hobbies? What did he eat? We just don't know. This might seem strange to some people because Hollywood films about ancient Greece and Rome show all the personal details.
What is it, honey?
God damn that Plato. I've been sat up all night and I still can't get my triangles as neat as his. I'll never be the greatest philosopher in Athens.
Oh, Aristotle, you will. You will. And if you weren't too boneheaded to stop considering the universality of change within a given substance and look at me once in a while, you might realize I love you.
Something else we're fairly sure of is that Aristotle's father was Nicomachus, court physician to King Amyntas, so he wasn't poor but was dependent on the royal family. Nicomachus died when Aristotle was a boy, and at the age of 17 his guardian sent him to Athens to a new school called the Academy, which was run by Socrates' most famous student, Plato.
Now, the unfortunate thing about Plato is that although nobody has much idea what he looked like, every modern drawing of him conforms to the stereotype philosopher. Old, bald, with a long, straggly, unkempt beard. So instead of looking like a genius, he looks like he would have been sat there going, "Perception is a form of reality we can never comprehend. She left me the bitch. Well, how do I know if she was ever really there or not?" Plato had complete contempt for anyone who laboured, as this was concerned only with the trivia of earthly life. Referring to anyone who worked who tried to make sense of philosophy, he said,
"They are like some bald-headed little tinker who's just come out of prison, had a wash at the baths and dressed himself up as a bridegroom ready to marry his master's daughter. Could the issue of such a match ever be anything other than contemptible bastards?"
Though even that was an advanced view, as there wasn't another Greek to come out with stuff like that until Prince Philip.
The chief idea which attracted Aristotle was Plato's attempt to resolve how we perceive something to be a particular thing. For example, said Plato, we might know something as a bed, but then we see another bed which may be completely different, but it's still a bed. In fact, no two beds are the same. What is it about an object that makes it a bed? There must be something, said Plato, or some set of rules which constitute the ideal, perfect bed. But this ideal bed, which Plato called the form of a bed, doesn't exist in the material world only as an unseen concept. We can contemplate the perfect bed, but we can't spend the day recovering from a hangover in it.
And the same goes for all concepts. What's beautiful, he said, changes according to each individual, but there must be a genuine perfect beauty that exists only as a concept. Plato's point is that the world we see is an imperfect copy of a conceptual world that is accessible only to those people who are prepared to dedicate their lives to contemplation and philosophy. Now, for 10 years, Aristotle was assumed to be Plato's most brilliant student, but then in 347 BC, Plato died, and it's clear that there had been a break between the ideas of the two men, because then Aristotle was passed over for the job of taking over the academy.
He found it impossible to go along with the idea that the most important things in the universe were things that aren't there. Nothing can exist only in its form without being attached to anything, he said. Things like beauty can't exist without an actual object to exist in. You can have a beautiful bed or a beautiful cat or beautiful flowers, but you can't just have beauty.
Aristotle got quite stroppy about this, saying,
So, goodbye to Plato's forms, for they are no more meaningful than singing la la la.
Aristotle's turn to studying things as they really are led to his philosophical exile from Athens. Now, it might seem as if all this arguing is about nothing. This would be the attitude of my parents' generation. If Plato had asked them, why is that a bed, they'd have said, because it is. But then if they were asked, where are the pyramids, they'd say, where you bloody well left them.
once Aristotle had broken against the notion that the mechanics of the universe are beyond our comprehension, he was able to pursue an understanding of every aspect of the world around him. He spent the next years in Asia Minor studying and categorising 500 species of animal,
analysing the different systems of government, developing theories on how the planets work, and compiling a list of Olympic champions. But then the city he was teaching in was overrun by Persians, and Aristotle immediately fled. So what did the Persians do then to make Aristotle give up teaching? Maybe they put Ofsted inspectors at the back of the classroom with a spear and a clipboard taking notes, then sold off the Olympic training fields, introduced a compulsory slavery hour, and then said, I can't understand it. They don't seem to be recruiting any teachers. Aristotle went to the city of Mytilene to teach a class that included the future Alexander the Great.
Aristotle then returns to Athens to set up his own school, the Lyceum, on this site, apparently in opposition to the academy. So presumably then some parents were saying, I know the Lyceum's right over the other side of the Parthenon, but it does have a very good reputation. And then blocked up the roads every morning by taking their kids there on 20-foot wide horses.
Aristotle's lecture style was to conduct his lessons while he was walking around and outside the building, which must have caused havoc. Aristotle did 2 sets of lectures most days. The first was a detailed session for his students, and in the evening he did a simpler version for the public. So that in itself was a break from Plato's belief that the public were ignorant and unworthy. To show that you can't necessarily tell what something is just by relying on your senses, Aristotle did an experiment in which he took 2 vessels, one containing white liquid and one black liquid. Drop by drop he put the black liquid into the white liquid, but obviously the colour didn't appear to change until there were several drops of black liquid in it. Up to that point the white liquid appeared to be exactly the same as before, but in fact it wasn't. He concluded that everything is in a state of constant change, which led him back to the problem, what is it about something that makes it what it is? Is an apple still an apple while it's decomposing? When is an organisation no longer the one it once was? When is something not what it was before?
I went to see the Four Tops once and none of the original members were in the band. They were just session musicians. So, have I seen the Four Tops or not? I don't know. Aristotle's answer was that everything contains an essence, its driving force that remains unchanged and propels it through its journey from beginning to end.
A person may change in appearance or size, but there is something which remains essentially them throughout. For example, to pick someone at random, Noel Edmonds. First he was on the radio, then on the telly, then just in papers, and now back on the radio again. But throughout he remains in essence a deeply nauseating tosser.
Welcome to the House of Fun.
Aristotle fitted these ideas into his science. Free from the view that everything was an imitation of a godly concept, he could analyse the material world and seek each body's essence. So he worked out that everything was made up of 4 elements: fire and air, whose essence was taking them on a natural journey upwards towards the sky, and earth and water, whose essence was taking them towards the ground.
He worked out from dissecting chickens that the heart was the central organ of the body. He analysed money, concluding that it works because it relates to an amount of labour that's been spent on the thing it's buying, an early form of Marx's labour theory of value.
Few things can be more obvious than the fact that Marx was wrong. But Aristotle could only develop his scientific theories because he was prepared to challenge the idea that certain bodies are beyond comprehension. So Aristotle, as well as using his methods to explain the natural world and astronomy, devoted a large part of his studies to what he called ethics. Here he tried to show how human beings could be, as he put it, virtuous, prudent and magnanimous. Sometimes the translation is a little awkward. For example, there's a whole chapter on people who behave in an antisocial way.
But the word he uses to describe this is incontinence. At one point he says,
The incontinent man does wrong because he feels like it.
A lot of the book is concerned with friendship. To find the ideal way to behave, he said, in ethics, meant searching for what he called the golden mean. In every area of behaviour, he said, there are
3 dispositions, 2 of them vicious and 1 good, the mean.
every virtue, he said, was the middle way between 2 vices. So in the middle of the book is a table laying this out. Under conversation is on one side buffoonery, on the other side boorishness, and in the middle wittiness is just right. But some of them are a bit obvious. For example, ambition. You can have over-ambition, unambitious, or proper ambition. Anyone can do that. You might as well have porridge. Too hot, too cold, or just right. Nevertheless, he'd written the world's first self-help book.
One point made by the Ethics, which Aristotle himself possibly didn't see, is that what is considered acceptable behaviour depends to some extent on your social position. It condemns the decadence of the rich as licentiousness and says,
It's not easy for a liberal man to be rich, since he is neither acquisitive nor retentive of money.
Aristotle seems to have grasped the nature of the rich. In Ethics, he gives an example of how a business deal can end up.
Dionysius I promised to pay a fee to a harpist. The better he played, the higher the fee would be. But the next morning the harpist asked for his money, and Dionysius replied that he had already paid him by giving him the pleasure of anticipating the money.
Aristotle was contemptuous of wealthy decadence, but nor did he have much time for the typical ways of the poor. Of labourers, he said,
Their way of life is despicable, and there is no room for excellence in any occupation to which people of that sort put their hands.
Even better, in the middle of all this complex philosophy, he says,
But a man can scarcely be happy if he is ugly.
So there was a thread running through his ideas. Everything and everyone contains an essence that drives it, him or her. So we can analyse the world, the stars, human behaviour, animals, the winner of the 4x400 metres relay, but we can't do much to change any of them because everything and everyone is carrying out its role destined to it by nature. And for Aristotle in Athens, the layer of society that seemed to be the most naturally worthy were the small farmers and poorer citizens. Aristotle's wish for moderate behaviour between 2 undesirable extremes is, I think, a reflection of how he sees the ideal people as this middle and supposedly moderate layer. That is why he was appealing to the people of Athens to behave in a moderate way. And these people needed a code, because there were law courts but no written laws. That poor harpist couldn't take Dionysius to the small claims court. There weren't people wandering through the streets of Athens going, excuse me, have you suffered an injury in the last 12 months? The Ethics was an attempt to provide a moral and legal code for the middle order.
This set of ideas becomes clearer in the notes which became Aristotle's most famous book, Politics.
The first question he addressed was slavery. The Greek for slave was instrumental vocali, which means tool that talks. Slaves weren't allowed to breed without permission, and Posidonius wrote that when slave women gave birth, they should carry on working for the rest of the day. Though you can imagine people today saying, oh, how marvellously natural. I mean, we were going to give the cleaner the day off on the day she gave birth, but once I read Posidonius, I thought, well, she'll find it much more spiritual if I make her scrub the loft.
And what about this one? A slave's evidence was not admissible in court unless they had first been tortured, and if he was disabled in the process, the owner received compensation.
The way Aristotle justified slavery was by saying that it was natural, that it was to the benefit of everybody if we each play out our natural role. As you put it.
Some are intended by nature to be lord and master, while he who can do no more than labour with his body is by nature a slave.
By way of proof, he offers that
it is also nature's intention to distinguish even the bodies of freemen and slaves. The latter are usually endowed with strength to suit their employment, while the upright carriage of the former renders them unfit for servile work.
Which is convenient. I would help, but it's the upright carriage, you see.
in his writing in Politics, Aristotle was trying to apply his philosophy to governing Athens. He had to work out what was everyone's natural state and how could they be kept there.
Women, like slaves, said Aristotle, should take their place as inferior beings to comply with nature. Though to be fair, he also quoted Hesiod approvingly, when he said for a man to create a household he needs...
first a house, then a wife, then an ox.
He also said...
women should marry at the age of about 18 years, and men at about 37, but then their prospective powers of procreation will decline simultaneously.
It's worth noting that he wrote this when he was about 37.
Aye, girls. Very nice.
Then he insisted that conception should always take place in the winter as strong winds from the north ensure sturdy babies. In which case there were probably ancient Greek Geordies that went, "I were conceived in a blizzard, man!"
But as in ethics, while he justified slavery and the inferior role of women, he wasn't a fan of the rich. He wrote,
"Some persons believe that the whole idea of their lives is to increase their money without limit. They turn every quality or art into a means of getting wealth. As such, they are intent upon living only, and not upon living well.
So,
a watch should be kept over the social group which happens to be flourishing at any one time. Raise no man too high above his fellow citizens."
His idea was that the poor couldn't be put in charge because they were envious of the rich, so couldn't rule fairly. But also, Aristotle saw the rich as unfit to rule because their main concern was protecting their wealth from the poor. The best way to rule, he said, was to
attempt a strengthening of the middle class, which will put a stop to dissensions rising from inequality.
As with ethics, it's important to realise here that he wasn't talking about a middle class as we know it. There wasn't a whole social strata moving around Athens going, "Oh, we've got the builders in at the moment, it's absolute hell. We're having the columns and the statues taken out so that we can knock the bath and the temple into one."
some of Aristotle's ideas may sound odd to us, but the fact that they're as pertinent as they are is extraordinary. He was writing 2,400 years ago, when everybody believed in oracles, which were places where people went to ask the gods for advice. And then a priestess, sometimes in a trance, would mouth the answer of the gods with a cryptic message.
Aristotle was working in an environment in which every belief was dominated by spirituality. Food supply, social status, biology, astronomy were all assumed to be the work of divine orders.
Which makes it extraordinary that his explanation of the universe wasn't overtaken until the 16th century, that his work on the categorisation of animals wasn't overtaken until the 18th century, and his knowledge of Olympic winners wasn't surpassed until the 20th century.
Jamie Botch.
Yes, the flamboyant.
Another constraint on Aristotle's thinking was that Athens had to be in a constant readiness for war, and this affected his attitudes on every issue, even music.
The learning of music should not harm the body by rendering it unfit for military training.
In particular, he mentions the flute.
There is another objection to the flute. It is an instrument expressive not of moral character, but rather of orgiastic states.
James Galway, there's more to you than meets the eye. The decline of Athens did result in its eventual fall to Macedonian invaders, and following the death of Alexander the Great, there was an anti-Macedonian backlash, a sort of, well, they come over here, they take our philosophers' jobs.
Aristotle was charged with impiety, the same charge made against Socrates that resulted in his death sentence. So for the second time, Aristotle left Athens. But his achievement had been to revolutionise the idea of thought, so that it was no longer a pursuit for its own sake, but something to be applied so that we can find out how everything around us works, and how we should work to fit in with our surroundings.
As he left Athens, what would he have made of the American lecturer that I saw just over there, who was lecturing some students and pointing to a building where 500 jurors used to sit in one of the world's first law courts? And he said, the important point to note here is where the agumniation meets the triglyph. And I really regret now not grabbing hold of him and saying no. No, it isn't. This was where, at the dawn of civilization, the most extraordinary experiments in human history, including debates and legal battles and assemblies, were carried out. And the agumniation probably meets the triglyph because the plasterer wanted to knock off early and go and watch the Olympics.
1 year after leaving Athens, Aristotle died. Eventually the Greek cities were taken over by Rome, though the Romans held the Greek philosophers in high esteem and translated their works into Latin. Aristotle was adopted by Muslims under the Ottoman Empire, and his ideas became the basis for the philosophy of the Catholic Church, to the extent that the Vatican passed a papal law that his system had to be taught as correct. This was because they could use his ideas of everyone staying in their God-given order, though for some reason they missed out some bits, such as where he condemned those with too much wealth. One of the most impressive sides to Aristotle was that he questioned everything. He never accepted anything should be as it is because it's the law or because it is.
And because Aristotle saw every part of the universe as connected, when he questioned one aspect of it, he questioned the lot. Compare that to today, when society increasingly regards all ideas as a nuisance.
If you want to be a successful politician, have no opinions. You'll only need to change them again. And if you want to be a celebrity, be as vacuous as possible.
The motto of Aristotle's Academy was that education is valuable because it is right for men to inquire. Whereas today education seems to be all about tests and remembering facts, summed up by the teacher I heard about, who asked her class, right, come on everybody, what did the Vikings come in? Come on, we did this yesterday. Until one kid went, oh, was it longboats, miss? No. Was it ships, miss? No. Oh, come on, we've done this. It's hordes. The Vikings came in hordes. What would Aristotle have made of the system now, where almost every course or project has to be sponsored rather than be an aid to inquiry, so that soon a teacher will ask a kid, what's 2 and 2, and if the kid says 4, the teacher will say, no. The correct answer is, the number sponsored by Accurist is 4.
John Stuart Mill, of his own free will, on half a mind Shandy was particularly ill.
If you're not uninterested or over-keen, but just curious enough, the Open University is hosting the Mark Steele Lectures website at www.open2.net, with more on all the great thinkers in the series. So now's a great time to buy a computer.
A lovely little thinker, but a bugger when he's pissed.
BBC 4 is available with others on cable, satellite and now Freeview, a new 30-channel lineup. For your free guide, call